That would be great. Hey, last time together we were in chapter 1, and chapter 1, very, very interesting chapter. And we saw that the theme in chapter 1 is what we see here, Roman number 1, that God is jealous. And already my clicker just decided not to work. Okay, here we go. Good. All right, perfect. Thank you. God is jealous. And the theme is Nineveh will fall. It's going to happen and so forth. We saw in verses 2 through 8, God speaks of himself, and in doing so, he reminds us of several truths about God. Number one, he is a jealous God. We understood what that term jealousy is, and certainly from a perfect standpoint of God. Number two, we saw how God is a revenging God. He's a revenging God. He is a patient but just God. Number three, we saw that, and the text bears that out. Then number four, the text would also speak of that God is great in power. And because of that power, we saw number 5, his wrath is therefore incredible and irresistible. It is incredible and irresistible. And then number 6, we also understood that God is good. He's a refuge and he is a rememberer. We used it in context that he will remember those who are his. Those who have put their faith and trust in him, he is always that refuge for them, and he will remember them. And I love that truth there. Then last week together, we jumped into verse number 9 and following, in which God addresses himself to the Ninevites. And so letter B was God speaks to the Nineveh. In doing so in these verses, he made this abundantly clear. He would make an utter end of Assyria once and for all. That was the promise. The judgment would be swift. It would be sure. There would be no need for a second chance, a third chance. This was going to be it, is what God promised in these verses. Verse number 10, we saw that God would utterly expose their vulnerability, even as they believed they had none. Remember, we talked about how they were drunk with their pride. And the Bible speaks of that they were like a drunkard. Right? And they were so inebriated with their own pride, their own greatness. We kind of equated it to they believed their own press release, right? And they believed what was said about them and how they're the greatest nation. No one can stand against them was their mindset. We'll see how that kind of plays in a little bit tonight even. And so that was their attitude. And so this was going to be judgment on their pride. Number 3, we saw that God would utterly spoil their plans and plots against him and Israel. One of the great thrusts of our study last time together was as we looked back when Assyria had just blown through to basically the outer skirts of Jerusalem. And they stood out there and basically blasphemed God, blasphemed Hezekiah and the king, and told the Israelites they were crazy if they believed in their God and so forth. And we saw that their schemes and their plots that God just laid waste. Literally, God spoiled them. No longer were they quiet and many, as that we saw that Bible verse describe them. No longer were they seemingly invincible, no longer untouchable. Sennacherib and his generals' plots, the schemes, the plans were thwarted by the God of heaven. And in that moment, verse 12 and 13, Nahum kind of addresses Israel in the middle of it, right? And it's a word of comfort. God speaks to them, and he gives 3 promises. In verse 15, they are described as good tidings or good news. And we said the 3 are this. First of all, there's a verse 12. There's a promise, the promised end of Assyria being used of God to chasten. No longer would he be the tool, or they, be the tool in God's hands to chasten Israel. No longer would he bring them and allow them to have free reign to run over Judah and the entire nation of Israel. Number 2, verse 13 promised them that the end of the Assyrian bondage and threat. He would throw off the shackles. He would throw off the yoke of the Assyrians. And no longer would they be subservient to them and so forth, and captives and such. And then verse 15, and we'll say a little bit more about verse 15 tonight, but verse 15 has the promise of peace. And then it has a very practical application for all of us. If these things are true, then you and I need to go and do right. And I love how verse 15 puts it, right? It describes God as being greater than the wicked. He is able to deliver us. Much like we sing at times, he is able to deliver us, right? And he's able to deal with the wicked and those who oppress us and our enemies. And so the encouragement then in turn is for you and I to understand this is what God does for his own. So live for him. Put him first. Live for him. Love him and live for him. Delight in him, as we've talked on Sunday mornings, right? That kind of sets the table now, okay? So chapter 1, very simple. God is jealous. Nineveh's going to fall. Okay, God's going to keep his promise. He's going to do what he does. We looked at chapter 2, and chapter 2 changes themes just a little bit. And the focus becomes on God as the judge. And as the judge, how he's going to usher in and how he's going to bring punishment and chastening and judgment, how it's going to fall upon Nineveh. And so basically what we see described here is the how of Nineveh falling, how Nineveh will fall. Draw your attention back to verse 15 real quick, because verse 15 is kind of interesting. In the Hebrew, some believe that verse 15 goes with chapter 2. I think it's a perfectly placed as a segue between chapter 1 and chapter 2. As King James translators, certainly led by the Holy Spirit, I believe that they placed it very well here. It's a transition between chapter 1 and chapter 2, speaking on some things on chapter 1, but also chapter 2. And so look at verse 15 again. Behold, upon the mountains the feet of him that bringeth good tidings, that publisheth peace. O Judah, keep thy solemn feasts, perform thy vows, for the wicked shall no more pass through thee, okay? Here is now transitioning to chapter 2. Their time is done. They're not going to pass through you anymore. And then he makes the statement here, he is utterly cut off. Some of you reading that verse, you might do what I have done in reading it. Immediately your mind says, you know what, I've read something like that before, right? We've come across that before. In fact, we've come across it in the New Testament, right? Because Paul uses this. He quotes this statement here that we have here, and I like how he applies the analogy, the picture in this passage, in this verse. Let me back up here. First of all, in verse 15. Here it is. Romans 10:15. He says this: as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings of good things. Now, this is neat, isn't it? Because here it is, and we understand in the passage in Nahum, it's describing the peace that is being, listen, no more are the Assyrians going to plague you. They're not going to be a thorn in your flesh. God's going to deal with them. They won't pass through you again. They will be utterly cut off. That is the message of peace. That is the glad tidings. And boy, when they saw that messenger coming and they heard that news, that was exciting. That was the gospel and the good tidings of peace. I love how Paul applies it. Paul takes it to Romans chapter 10. He says, listen, blessed are the feet of those that bring the gospel of peace, the salvation of Jesus Christ. That you can have peace with your God, that you can have peace with now your Creator, that because of what Jesus Christ did, this is the gospel of peace. And I love how Paul applies it in Romans chapter 10. Very similar in the sense of the proclamation. Here, it is the salvation, deliverance from the Assyrians. When Paul applies it in Romans chapter 10, it is the good tidings that you and I can be delivered from the penalty of our sin. We can be delivered from hell. It is the gospel of peace. And I love how Paul applies it later on there. The Assyrians are going to utterly fall. This terrible oppressor they will be saved from. So now the chapter deals with how that's going to happen. How their capital city is going to fall in the future. Okay? But before we get to there, let's also understand what the chapter is predicated upon. It's predicated upon what I put in letter A here, how the city flourished before the judgment. Now, we've hit on this a little bit in our introduction of the book of Nahum, but I want to draw some things out that I think are important to understand context of chapter number 2. The city of Nineveh at the time, we know it was the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. If we go back far enough, in fact, one of the verses here, it calls it an old city, right? Verse 8, but Nineveh is of old like a pool of water. Some believe because it was close to the rivers and things, it was kind of swamp-like and things like that. But I draw your attention to the fact that it calls it like an old city. Well, it was. Nineveh goes back to Nimrod. Many of you remember Nimrod. In fact, he may be a favorite of some of the men here because the Bible calls Nimrod a mighty hunter. Some of us are mighty hunters, maybe in our own brain, amen, our own thoughts and our own stories. But boy, the Bible calls Nimrod a mighty hunter. Guess what? He's a mighty hunter, right? In fact, twice in Genesis, it calls him a mighty hunter. Well, Nimrod and his descendants were the ones who established and began the city of Nineveh. It's quite interesting. We go all the way back to Genesis, in Genesis chapter number 10. Okay, Genesis chapter number 10, it says this, and Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be mighty one in the earth, okay? And that's verse 8, verse 10 and such, kind of speak of him being the mighty hunter and things like that. But verse 11 we cut down to. Out of that land went forth Asher and builded Nineveh, So Nimrod has a part in this, and Asher and others too, and builded Nineveh and the city of Rehoboth and Calah and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. The same is a great city. And so already in Genesis chapter 10, these cities are growing and becoming big and so forth in this area that's known as Mesopotamia, the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, as it's called. In history, we call it the cradle of mankind, right? Cradle of humanity and so forth, and of life and so forth. And so here's a great city. It has, from early on, a great city in the Middle East. It was a rival to Babylon down through the ages because they were situated here in this valley only about 300 miles apart. You see it on the map here, and it's just a crude map that kind of represents where they are in the Middle East and the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. But they are very close in a sense. The two greatest cities here, Nineveh and in Babylon. Now, as we think of Nineveh, as we use the term Nineveh, it refers to a couple different things. We could say it's kind of used in two different ways. First of all, the term Nineveh, it refers to both the city proper. So you could think of, and I think a good illustration for us is Detroit, right? Well, there's a Detroit city limits, right? But there's also suburbs and villages and towns all around Detroit that a lot of people call Detroit as part of Detroit. And we think of them, when we say Detroit, we might encompass all of them. Well, that was what Nineveh was like. There's a large complex of associated villages and cities that are referred to, and I'll call them for sake of clarity, we'll call it Greater Nineveh. Okay, we might think of it as the Greater Detroit area. So think of it as the Greater Nineveh area that includes some villages and cities. In fact, some of those we just read in Genesis chapter 10, Calah and Rezin, these were considered as part of the Greater Nineveh area, in part of it, because they all shared the same irrigation system that connected to the Tigris River and the Kosar River and so forth. Also, the fortifications, the walls, we'll talk about in a minute, they stretched all the way to these other cities and villages that encompassed them. So, question is, how big of an area are we talking about? When I mentioned Detroit to you, we might say, hey, are you talking about the size of Detroit proper? Or are you talking about the greater Detroit area, or whatever the case may be? Well, when we're talking about the greater part of Nineveh, or the Greater Nineveh, it was around 30 miles long and about 10 miles wide. You think early on that was a huge city, a huge complex of villages and cities involved in that. In fact, likely this Greater Nineveh is what Jonah chapter 3, verse 3 talks about. As Jonah went into the city, you remember it says this, it calls Nineveh an exceeding great city of 3 days' journey. So to make it across this Greater Nineveh area was about 3 days' journey in that day. And so we can imagine that makes sense and so forth, that would fall in the description there. Now, I think what's also amazing about this Nineveh and the Greater Nineveh, it was protected by a network of 5 different walls. 3 moats or canals, too, where they used water from the rivers that were there and used them as defensive strategy, as means of defense and so forth. You say, well, how in the world did they build all this? Well, we know, right? Because they went into cities all across the Middle East and brought them back as slave labor. They brought these foreigners back, and they were slaves, Jews and others alike. They'd bring them back, and they would build these walls and dig these canals. And we think of even as the Israelites in Egypt and so forth and took place. And so they built these things through slave labor of foreign captives. The city proper, and we've kind of alluded to this, the city proper is located at the junction of the Tiger or Kosar rivers. And depending on atlases and depending on historical books, it's called, or spelled a little bit different, Kosar is. But either way, it's the junction where the Kosar River, I believe it is, breaks off of the Tigris River or runs into it, one of the two, and so forth. Now, what's interesting about some of these walls is the walls around the town proper. This is what we alluded to before, that these walls were reportedly 100 feet tall around the town proper. We'll see a picture of the town proper in a second. These walls were about 100 feet tall. They were wide enough, as we've said before, for 4 chariots to go abreast next to each other on top of them. Quite an amazing thought if you think about it in that. And furthermore, now this is astounding, okay? And we'll talk about how these things were discovered later on, and not too long ago for us, but much longer after Assyria existed as a nation. But they began discovering all this archaeological things and information about it, and they had close to, get this, 1,500 towers on those 5 different walls. And these towers were upwards of 200 feet. I don't know about you, but it makes me think of the Great China Wall, amen? And you think about the description and through these 5 walls, and again, we're talking covering 30 miles by 14 miles, or whatever the size of the city was, or 30 by 10, and approximately, obviously. And these walls surrounding this area and these towers for defense. I mean, this was a well-fortified city. We think of Jericho of old. We think of different cities that were just greatly fortified and protected and so forth. Nineveh was one of the greatest in this sense. I like the pictures here because it shows us where it is. The one certainly over here on my left and your right shows us right there where the rivers come together, where it's located. And then the smaller picture is a good example of what the city probably looked like. According to excavations, you can see some aerial photos even today that show similar shape to what Nineveh looked like as far as Nineveh proper, with the wall around it and so forth, the 200-foot wall. So a city of this size had to have a boatload of people in it, especially if they were bringing back captives regularly, and the city was prospering and so forth. And you remember what Jonah wrote, or Jonah recorded for us. Jonah made the statement that there were 600,000 persons that cannot discern between the right hand and their left hand. 120,000 babies, we could probably guesstimate, or very young toddlers that can't discern between the left hand and the right hand. Okay? So likelihood, at its zenith, at its time when it was the greatest, probably it's a safe bet to say there's 1 million people in this city. That the inhabitants, the citizens of Nineveh numbered in the millions, 1 million at the very least. It became a world power in a world center around 900 BC, and then for the next 2 to 3 centuries, it grew into a mighty and brutal beyond imagination head of the warrior state of Assyria. It was their capital city. So think of it with me. How was this city built during those centuries? Well, it was built on the spoil and the loot that they took from nations all around them, including Israel. We talked about how Hezekiah gave them gold out of his own house and gave them gold out of the temple. And you can imagine that they were not alone as a nation. They'd already taken care of the other kingdom of Israel, and they'd already taken care of other nations and so forth. And so they'd taken all this loot, all this spoil back to Nineveh. They had built this beautiful fortified city. There was a seemingly endless wealth that flowed into the city at this time from the ends of the earth. And don't miss it. That sets the table for chapter 2. Because now, all of it was coming to an end. Look at verse number 1 with me. Read it with me, would you? He that dasheth in pieces is come up before thy face. And then this interesting statement. Keep the munition. Watch the way. Make thy loins strong. Fortify thy power mightily. Okay? So number 1, we see how the city flourished before the judgment came, before judgment fell upon them. Letter B, I want you to see now, as most of the chapter deals with, how was this city going to fall? In other words, how was this going to come to place, this magnificent city, this fortified city? How was it going to fall in judgment that God was going to bring? Well, the year was somewhere around 612 BC. Now, again, guesstimation, 607, some have said, 607 to 612 BC. The Assyrians began to suffer defeat, unheard of. They began being defeated on the outskirts of their empire, and it slowly creeped, and sometimes quickly creeped, towards Nineveh, their capital city. So during this time, cities were falling. Assyrian cities and strongholds and outposts began to fall to a force that was moving its way. This invading force was an alliance between the Babylonians and Medes. You see, there's a king of the Babylonians. His name was Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar, he was the king of the Babylonians. And then there's a guy by Cyaxares, also many believe he was Ahasuerus in the Bible, was king of the Medes. So these two got together and they decided to make a pact against Assyria. Hey, let's join our forces against the Assyrians. They're much too powerful for just one of us, so let's get together. And in order to solidify and strengthen this alliance, they did what a lot of political leaders did, right? Here's what they did. Cyaxares, his daughter, married Nabopolassar's son. And so marriage solidified it, strengthened this alliance and so forth. And so they set out to take down the Assyrian Empire together. And Nahum here is given a word or even a vision potentially of prophecy about this combined army marching towards the great city of Nineveh. So understand, as Nineveh writes this, as he's given this to Israel, it isn't happening yet. He's looking into the future. We're not quite sure how many years, but several years before. And God has given him this word, this vision, and he's seeing the fall of this great city, Nineveh. And you can imagine the Ninevites hear this, or they read of it, they get word of it, and they're not going to believe it. No way our city's going to fall. No way the Medes and the Babylonians are going to make an alliance. No way those two nations are going to get along. Hey, can I just tell you, if God's in something, it's going to happen. And Nahum sees it, and they march against the great city of Nineveh. And we're given a glimpse in this chapter of how it's going to play out. It's quite neat. First of all, in verse number 1, it's like the guards, or at the very least, the leaders of the Assyrian army are attempting to prepare the soldiers, the people. Even as the shadow of the conquering army falls upon the walls that protect greater Nineveh, they begin to prepare them. Think about it. Look at verse number 1 again. It's like they're saying this: get the ammunition ready. Secure the fortifications. Keep your eyes on the roads leading to the gates. Keep your eyes on the wilderness. Strengthen yourselves. Be ready to fight. That's what verse number 1 is saying. It's kind of derisive, right? It's kind of, or derisive. It's kind of God through Nahum saying, listen, you can make all the preparations you want, but you're not going to be able to be ready for this. It's going to take you. It's going to be futile, we might say. The Assyrians trying to get ready and prepared for this. Why? Why would it be futile? Why does God say, hey, you can warn all you want, you can try to be prepared all you want? Because God was done, and don't miss the point, God was done using the Assyrians as the hand of his chastening of Israel. It was time for them to face the music, to reap the consequences of their own sins, as God was done using them as his tool. This is what verse 2 says. Look at verse number 2 with me, okay? Here's the point of verse number 2. For the Lord hath turned away the excellency of Jacob as the excellency of Israel, for the emptiers. Now that's a great description of the Assyrians. The emptiers have emptied them out and marred their vine branches. So it's a description that God has used them. He's taken away the excellency of Judah and Israel, but now it's stopped. Now it's done. No more is he going to use Assyria as the emptiers. No longer would they be allowed to plunder and spoil Israel in order to bring God's people back to him. Now it was a serious time to be judged and punished. In verses 3 and 4, gets a little in the details, the nitty-gritty of what Nahum sees about the siege and the battle that would play out. The soldiers and the chariots of the invading army crash through the different layers and walls of fortification. Different parts of the cities fall before the Assyrians. And there's great clashes that happen all around the city. Look at verse 3 with me, if you will. Verse 3, we'll read both verse 3 and 4. The shield of his mighty men is made red. The valiant men are in scarlet. The chariot shall be with flaming torches in the day of the preparation, of his preparation. And the fir tree shall be terribly shaken. Verse 4, the chariot shall rage in the streets. They shall jostle one against another in the broad ways. They shall seem like torches. They shall run like the lightnings. It's a vivid description. Some historians believe, and reading some things later that were recovered archaeologically speaking, and even historical accounts to some degree of Babylon and so forth, it seems that this siege may have taken up to 2 years for the greater Nineveh to fall. All of those little cities and villages, and then reaching the main city and so forth, the city proper. The whole time, you see the description? The shields would be covered with blood. I also think that the allusion here to their mighty men wearing scarlet would be that they would be stained with blood and so forth. It's a dire description, right? It's also a description that on their chariots they would bring torches and fire to set the city on fire. They would lay waste to it. It would literally be razed to the ground. The city would. In fact, the description is here that there would be such a large invading force that the fir trees would shake from the rumble, the vibration of the marching feet and driven chariots. Not many here have been in what we would call a war zone. But we've read of it, and we've seen of it, and maybe we've seen videos of it if you've ever been around airplanes and maybe even artillery shooting and so forth, you know, wow, the noise factor is huge. And so you can imagine what's described here. Literally so much trembling and rumbling that even the fir trees are shaking. And then that last verse kind of describes the chariot battles that happen in the roadways and the streets. And then the army sweeping through like fire and all consuming and all destroying fire, and like lightning, how quick they are, and overtaking parts of the city. Nineveh's great walls and fortifications. In man's estimations, they were the greatest ever, or one of the greatest ever. The city would never fall, but they would prove to be weak and paper thin defense against the invaders. Was it because the Medes and the Babylonians were such a great force together? Was it because these nations far outmatched the Ninevites and the Assyrians? No way. This happened in chapter 2, and everything that's described is going to befall Nineveh simply because the city would fall because God had decreed it. He had decreed the city's overthrow. And what God decrees, no man can stand against. He had already prophesied. He had decreed it. This is what's going to happen to you. There'll be no second chances. We've seen it in chapter 1. And boy, when you read that, it really reminds me of what we read in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 27. We've seen this verse before. For the Lord of hosts hath purposed it. It's his will. It's purpose. And who shall disannul it? Who's going to change it? And his hand is stretched out. And who shall turn the hand of God back? Who shall turn it back? Who's going to turn it away from what he purposes? Oh, the king of Assyria is going to try, but it will not work. Look at verse number 5. This is quite the description. Verse number 5. He shall recount his worthies. They shall stumble in their walk. They shall make haste to the wall thereof, and the defense shall be prepared. Okay, so picture it. When he says it here in verse number 5, interesting terminology. He shall recount his worthies. Literally, he's going to gather his most trusted advisors, his generals, those who know war and those who know about fortification. Maybe even some political leaders and anybody he thinks will help. He will gather them together, and they will make all these plans, and they'll do their best to fortify the walls. They'll run to the wall. They'll try to make it secure and fortify it. And as they look to their walls and their own building for their defense and salvation. But I love the description. In this, they will stumble. They will not. It's not going to stand before God. They will not be able to stand against them. It won't work. They will falter in their preparations and defense. Now, verse 6 speaks a little bit about, it's quite, again, another interesting verse, because it describes one of the strategies the Medes and the Babylonians would employ to breach the city and destroy it. Look at verse number 6 with me, if you will. Verse 6 says this, the gates of the river shall be opened, and the palace shall be dissolved. Picture washed away, okay? And so what do we see here? Well, you remember the picture we saw, the Kosar River runs right through it. And that was on purpose. It would bring water to them and so forth. But it also proved to be kind of a two-edged sword. Though it would bring water into it, an enemy could use it. And so that's exactly what the Medes and the Babylonians did. They used this Kosar River in the fact that Nineveh was right there on the banks of the Tigris River. And so it's likely, what did they do? Well, they did one of several things. Very likely they dammed up the rivers. Perhaps they even diverted them to build up a great reservoir of water and then released that water so it destroyed parts of the wall, kind of washed out the foundation, and then the wall would fall and then allow it to go into the city and the building. And the verse is quite interesting because it seems to allude to that the water would have reached the palace of their king of the time and washed it away, dissolved it. Quite a picture. It is possible, too, that and likely that the Assyrians themselves had built gates to control the Kosar River and during flood times and things like that, to control how much water came into the city and so forth. And so you can imagine if they, at the flood time, if they were there for over a year, they would have been there at least during one flood season. And so they could have broken down the gates, controlled the gates to allow water to flood into the city of Nineveh and to wash it away and just recap. So we can imagine as looking on the city that it would be like some of the cities underwater, that it was in a flood, right? And so it's a flooded part of the city, and they control it to do that. You know, obviously, too, if the waters washed away the foundation of the wall, if the waters breached the town, this would also open a pathway, an entrance for the people of Nineveh, the people of the Medes and the Babylonians to come in and overthrow the city. And that is exactly what happens. As this all transpires and the city in general falls, the greater Nineveh falls, and then the city proper falls, the Bible describes that as it does so, and they take large swaths of land and large parts of the city, that the people became captives. And they were marched off, and as they were marched off, the city would be spoiled on an unprecedented level. Look at verse number 7. Would you with me? And Huzzab shall be led away captive. She shall be brought up, and her maids shall lead her as with the voice of doves. And that's the kind of idea of mourning doves, doves of mourning, not in the morning, but the mourning, weeping, tabering or beating upon their breasts. Verse 8. But Nineveh is of old like a pool of water. What a description here. Yet they shall flee away. Stand, stand, shall they cry, or some cry, but none shall look back. Verse 9. Take ye the spoil of silver, take the spoil of gold, for there is none end, an endless supply, none end of the store, and glory out of all the pleasant furniture. That term, Huzzab or Huzzab, however you want to pronounce it, there's kind of a couple different schools of thought on it. The first is that Huzzab was probably could have referred to the queen of the Assyrian empire, the queen of the king, and so forth. And so describing her, carried away into captive, her maids ministered her. Others believe it's just a general term describing the city of Nineveh, that it's describing this city and how it's the captives, the citizens are carried away captives and so forth. And so either way, the picture is them being carried away captive. There's great mourning as of mourning doves, and there is this crying, right? Sorrow and grief. And in the Middle East, you've seen it before, people beating their chest in sorrow and lamenting, beating their chest and sadness and so forth. So that's the picture here. You can imagine when the city's fate was sealed, when wall after wall fell and they breached the moats and they got into the inner city and the city proper, all hope is gone. There is no hope. There is no thought that we can still win this. There's no thought of standing against the enemy. So you can imagine that some would immediately say, we got to run. We've got to flee this place. That Nineveh has fallen. And you can imagine that word spreading. Nineveh has fallen. And people begin fleeing the city. And I love how the verse describes. Someone will say, no, stand, stay, fight. And they don't listen. They don't turn back, the Bible says. They will not stay the course. And as the invading soldiers begin to take groups of people away as captives, the great spoiling of the city begins. The great wealth, treasures, and spoil they had amassed during their reign of terror was now a spoil for other nations. And so we sometimes read of Babylon and we think, well, how did they become so prosperous? How did they gain so much credit? They took a lot of what was in Nineveh. And certainly the Medes did too. And so as they did other nations, and so they took all this spoil. And boy, what a description we read in that verse. There was no end of the silver and the gold and the treasures found in Nineveh. And so these invading nations took them, Babylon and the Medes. And then we come to verse 10. Verse 10 is a sad description. All that we've just read, and notice what verse 10 says. She is empty and void and waste. And the heart melteth, the knees smite together, and much pain is in all loins, and the faces of them all gather blackness. And it is a poetic description, a vivid description of how those people must have felt. You see it on the outline. We just sum it up. Their hearts would melt. The heart melted. Their knees would knock together and bodies trembling out of fear and devastation and sorrow over what has befallen their great city, the city they loved. And you can imagine those faces, some growing pale, others growing dark with the burdens of loss and pain and great sorrow. Well, let's step back and remind ourselves. Because right now, as described, what is happening is described. It is these people getting a full taste of what nations before had tasted at the hands of the Assyrian army. They're getting a taste of their own medicine. They are experiencing now themselves what they have done to many other nations. Can we just say, her sin, the cities, her sin has found her out. Be sure your sin will find you out. Now, there's only one more thing for us to consider. We understood how the city flourished before the judgment. We understood how the city was going to fall according to God, and he prophesied this, and it came to pass. As kind of begs the question, doesn't it? From a historical standpoint, I often wonder whatever happened afterwards. And we'll put it in letter C, this. How the city will fare after the judgment? He obviously addresses this in the passage. Look at verse 11. It's quite interesting. He says this, where is the dwelling of the lions and the feeding place of the young lions, where the lion, even the old lion, walked, and the lions whelp, and none made them afraid? What a great description. Verse 12, the lion did tear in pieces, enough for his whelps, strangled for his lioness, and filled his holes with prey. And so just picture a lion getting plenty of food and putting it in a hole and covering it, saving it for later. Spoil for later is the picture here. In his dens with raven there. Okay? I love the description here. It's a very vivid picture with some irony mixed in. Okay? If you were to describe the Assyrian nation when they were in power, one of the great pictures of it is something they picked for themselves. You see, in Assyrian art and architecture and inscriptions that has been found more recently and so forth, you know what they find, how they picture themselves? As lions. Lions, time and time again, they picture the Assyrians as a great lion, a young, strong, healthy lion, a lion who devours, a lion that hunts and kills and devours its prey. And it really is a fitting picture because they acted like this. A fierce pride of lions. And I like how verse 11 and 12, especially the latter part of verse 12 says, it kind of describes them as a den, and that last word of verse 12, a den of ravenous lions. One that no one made afraid, a den filled with prey and the spoils of their conquest over other nations. I mean, that's a great picture. This is who Nineveh was, the Assyrians. But then verse 11 starts out with a question. Because this is the aftermath. This is after Nineveh has fallen. This is after the Medes and the Babylonians have come in and laid waste. The question in verse 11 is just those first three words, really, okay? Ooh, here we go. They were a den of rabbits right here. Where is the dwelling? 4 words. Where is the dwelling? Where to go? Where is it? Where is this great city? Where has it gone? Is kind of the picture here. What's happened to it? Well, God explains in verse 13. Look at verse 13. Would you with me? Verse number 13. Behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts. And I will burn her chariots in the smoke, and the sword shall devour thy young lions. And I will cut off thy prey, the sustenance from the earth, and the voice of thy messengers shall no more be heard. We would put it this way. Where is the dwelling? Where is the den of the ravenous lions? Well, we would paraphrase it this way. It is gone, saith the Lord of hosts. Yes, he is against thee. He has set his face against you. See, this was going to happen from the hand of God. It would be complete so that all the world, and especially the Israelites, would know that this is the doing of Jehovah. This is the doing of your God that has promised it. And the descriptions and wording here, again, as we have seen throughout Nahum, is rather ominous. I will burn your chariots. I will devour you with the sword, or you will be devoured with the sword. Your prey, the sustenance by which you survive, will be cut off. What you eat upon will no longer be available. You will no longer be the one who takes it. And then that last statement, your messengers will not be heard. You realize what it's saying? Your voices will be silenced. Your voices will be silenced. I can't help but think of what was said about this once great city in that first little statement of verse 10. It is a prophetical statement. She is empty and void and waste. She is empty and void and waste. And that is exactly what befell the great city. Listen carefully. Do you know that Nahum isn't the only minor prophet that talks about the downfall of Nineveh? These small little books here at the end of the Old Testament, there's another one that speaks to and prophesies about what's going to happen to Nineveh. And it's an intriguing prophecy. It's found in Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. Here's what he wrote. Verse 13, he says this, and he will stretch out again his hand against the north and destroy Assyria and will make Nineveh a desolation and dry like a wilderness. Man, strong words. He goes on, verse number 14, and flocks shall lie down in the midst of her. All the beasts of the nation, wild animals will feed here. Just turn this once great city into an open prairie or place or field, if you could put it that way. Both the cormorant and the bittern shall lodge, two different animals in the upper lintels of it. Their voice shall sing in the windows. Desolation shall be in the thresholds, for he shall uncover the cedar work. And then he goes on in verse number 15. Oops, there we go. This is the rejoicing city. Now don't miss it. That dwelt carelessly. Without a care in the world. Didn't care what God said. That revival that Jonah came and preached, we're done with that. We don't need God. Dwelt carelessly. That said in her heart, I am and there is none beside me. How is she become a desolation? A place for beasts to lie down. Everyone that passeth by her shall hiss and wag his hand. A Middle East sign of, boy, I don't want to have anything to do with that. Shame on them. Would not want to have their end. Would not want to face what they face. I would not want to have their fate. That is the description here. And what is prophesied here in Zephaniah, listen, don't miss it, is exactly what happened to the city of Nineveh. It literally, historically, became a wilderness. It was basically forgotten for not just centuries, millenniums. This once great city that boasted the world, oh yeah, we know Nineveh, we know about the Assyrian Empire, kind of got forgotten. It's quite amazing, really, if you think about it. Allow me, just take a couple more minutes, and can I show you some things? You see, just a few years later, couple hundred years later, there's a man, and forgive me if I pronounce his name wrong, but Xenophon, and he was a Greek military leader. He was a philosopher. He was also a historian, so he took accounts and journals and so forth. He was going through this area of the Middle East with about 10,000 soldiers, and it was quite interesting as they were covering where Nineveh once was. His recollection of it was simply this. He thought the little mounds that they found, the animals dwelling there and so forth, as he looked upon it, he thought there was nothing there but the remains of a Parthian city, another nation sometime before and so forth. That was just the leftovers of one of their small cities. That's what he thought. Many years later, somebody you and I both know, Alexander the Great was in the same area. In fact, he fought a battle not too far from there. And in doing so, he marched over where Nineveh had been. And he records for us later on, looking back, he says, I did so not knowing that a world empire was buried beneath our feet. It's been forgotten. In fact, for nearly 2,500 years, 2,500 years, the ruins of Nineveh disappeared. They were not seen. They were not found. In fact, this is astounding. All the traces of the glory of the Assyrian Empire were so completely wiped away that some scholars began to push the idea that any mention of the empire in the scriptures or historical references even outside the Bible were referring to a mythical empire that never existed. So this became somewhat prevalent among some scholars. Saying, you know what, we don't find anything. We don't find any leftovers of this great city and so forth. We can't find anything that proves this. Can I tell you, my friend, what God does well. If God says he's going to make you a wilderness, he'll make you a wilderness. If God says he's going to take a once great city and make it like no one remembers you, he'll do so. Do you realize it wasn't until 1842 to about 1845 that archaeologists finally, definitively identified the site of where Nineveh had stood? As they did so, in the years afterwards, much excavation transpired and took place. Magnificent palace of the many Assyrian leaders down through the centuries were found and unearthed. Thousands upon thousands of inscriptions were found, and that is what gives us a lot of the historical information about the Assyrian Empire, about the times they lived in. Much of what we looked at tonight, what I shared with you about the city, was found in these inscriptions. You know what's kind of interesting? We know this to be true already, but the world finds kind of interesting. All those inscriptions, they all confirmed what the Bible already said about the Assyrian Empire. They went right along with it. They just showed, the Bible's right. One of the most astounding finds was a library that was found at Ashurbanipal. It contained 10,000 volumes, historical and descriptive of Assyria and the kings and so forth. Quite amazing. A third of those have already been recovered and are in the British Museum even today. And so this city, the world comes to the realization, it did exist. But it faced an apocalypse, faced great devastation. And the world is amazed at such things, but you and I read the book of Nahum, and we're not surprised. Because what has been found just backs up what Nahum writes in this book. Nineveh's time was up. The end was coming. God was against them. The Lord of hosts was against them. And they would be left no nation, no city, no leaders, no weapons, no victories, no land, not even messengers. And verse 13 makes it clear. That statement, "And the voice of thy messengers shall no more be heard." Don't miss it. There's still a message that was going to go out. It wasn't from the Assyrians. Do you remember what verse 15 of chapter 1 said? You know the message that's going out? The gospel of peace. The good news, the good tidings that Assyria has fallen, that Assyria has been destroyed, that God has judged them, and the city is no more. Those messages would go throughout all of Israel and the Middle East, and that would bring comfort and encouragement to Israel. And my friend, I can't help but ending with this reminder what Genesis chapter 18, verse 25 says. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Shall not God always do right? His way is perfect. And Nahum chapter 2 shows how God did exactly that. And as you and I look back through the lens, the magnifying glass of history and archaeology, we see that all of it backs up exactly what God said in Nahum chapter 2. Next